thinking means considering the long-term impact of our actions to the seventh generation to follow. Try to honor the wisdom back to your great-grandparents and to consider the legacy you are leaving for your great-grandchildren. One issue is that generational research reminds us of how differently each succeeding generation sees the world. So, how do we keep up? One of the tools I've found helpful in shifting my perspective is the Mindset List, which is released every August by Bellwick College to help professors be aware of dated references. The most recent Mindset List included 60 cultural touchstones that shape the lives of students entering college. I'll share only a few of them. For current college freshmen, keep in mind that Eminem and LL Cool J could show up at Parents' Weekend. GM means food that is genetically modified. As kids, they may well have seen Chicken Run, but probably never got chicken pox. Having a chat has seldom involved talking. Threatening to shut down the government during federal budget negotiations has always been an anticipated tactic. With GPS, they have never needed directions to get someplace, just an address. They have never attended a concert in a smoke-filled arena. Myself, at age 36, I'm twice as old as our recent 18-year-old high school graduates, and generationally, I'm part of the tail end of Generation X, having been born just after Star Wars came out. Current high school graduates were born around 1996 and are solidly in the middle of Generation Y, also known as the Millennial Generation. But millennials, don't get too cocky about your youth. Generation Z is waiting for you. Generation Z will never know a print edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, only Wikipedia. And Generation Z will also never know a world in which only white men can be president. When I consider my own religious denomination of Unitarian Universalism through the lens of generational theory, the merger of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America into Unitarian Universalism happened in 1961. And in many ways, predominant UUism, most of us know, has been heavily influenced by the baby boomers who came of age in the 60s and 70s. Some demographers see the millennial as an echo boom because many of them are children of boomer parents. For most millennials, the defining event of their early lives were the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. And as a generation deeply shaped by social media, they have also grown up knowing both the promise and perils of an increasingly globalized and interdependent world. One piece of advice I offer is not only to leverage technology to stay connected and create social change, but also to find times and places in which you can embrace the luxury of unplugging from technology to be fully present to the world without that filter. As the state representative Boyd Brown of South Carolina said, my generation acknowledges science, and we want to protect our planet. My generation does not hate gay people. We don't hate any people. My generation does not fear the future. We welcome change. And ladies and gentlemen, as a word of caution to you, my generation is sprinting this way. Please join us in silent meditation, followed by musical meditation. The sermon I will be reading today is entitled An Honest Heretic, Religion, Science, and Dr. Joseph Priestley. And if you want to know why I chose this sermon, there's a story I will tell you later if you're interested. It was given by the Reverend Dr. J. Carl Gregg at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Frederick, Maryland on January 25th of this year. Originally, the Unitarian and Universalist sides of our heritage were theologically liberal branches of Protestant Christianity that emphasized Jesus' life, teachings, and ethics. They increasingly taught that Jesus wanted others not to worship him, but to follow his way of self-giving love in their own time and place. As our UU slogans go, we are a religion of deeds, not creeds, and salvation by character. We are saved from ourselves by how we treat others, as opposed to salvation by believing 6 impossible things before breakfast, as the Red Queen told Alice she sometimes does. As the Unitarians and Universalists grew closer and eventually consolidated in 1961 to form the Unitarian Universalist Association, they also became an increasingly big tent. The original emphasis on Jewish and Christian teachings expanded into the 6 sources that we know today. Do we have our 6 sources and 7 principles on our public service?
It's in the first page of the hymnal.
It's in the first page of the hymnal?
Let's see. Yeah, inside Jack at the bottom.
Right.
Those are the 7 principles, but she's looking for the traditions that we base our faith on.
Right.
Yeah.
The six sources. Okay. Additionally, I've heard the argument made that we should add a 7th source, our UU history and heritage. We are much more than a newfangled religion that started in the 1960s. Not that there's anything wrong with things that started in the 60s. But it is significant to recognize that the roots of our Unitarian heritage go back to the 1500s in Europe, and our Universalist roots go back to the 1700s. If you travel through New England, you will find Unitarian congregations that are well more than 300 years old. Our theological ancestors courageously demanded that the Bible be interpreted in light of reason, cutting-edge scholarship, and what they knew to be true in their own first-hand experience. It's no coincidence that the Protestant Reformation began in the early 1500s, barely 50 years after the invention of the movable type printing press, which helped produce mass copies of the Bible that individuals could read and interpret for themselves. What they discovered conflicted with centuries of tradition, creeds, and liturgy. Likewise, going back to the 1700s in North America, a time when there was widespread anxiety about whether one's self, family, and friends were predestined for eternal torment in an afterlife, our Universalist ancestors began preaching a message of universal salvation for all people, based on love, and eventually that our focus should not be on salvation in the next world, but on loving the hell out of this world. So, while I deeply appreciate our 6 sources, we also have more than 5 centuries of Unitarian history and more than 2 centuries of Universalist history, our own history and heritage from which we can draw support, ancestors of courage, conscience, and conviction that can inspire our work today in building the beloved community. One reason that I'm starting this morning with Joseph Priestley is that we, meaning Frederick, Maryland, are in the subdivision of the UUA known as the Joseph Priestley District. We named our district after Priestley because of his influence in spreading Unitarianism in this area. Although he was raised in a strict Calvinist family, by his early 20s he was a free-thinking minister-scientist unafraid to experiment with both theology and science. If this sermon leaves you interested in learning more, there is a recent 2-volume biography by Robert Schofield from Penn State University Press that weighs in at about 800 pages. A more accessible introduction to Priestley is Stephen Johnson's The Invention of Error, which is only 200 pages and aimed at a popular audience. Although Priestley's name is less well known today, he was quite influential in his own time. As one example, among the 165 letters that Presidents John Adams and Thomas Jefferson exchanged near the end of their lives, Benjamin Franklin is mentioned by name 5 times, while George Washington is mentioned 3 times. Their mutual nemesis, Alexander Hamilton, warrants only 2 references. By contrast, Priestley, an Englishman, who spent only the last decade of his life in the United States, is mentioned 52 times. Priestley always wanted to share his insights widely. When the English scientist Isaac Newton wrote his landmark book, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, in 1687, he wrote in Latin. In contrast, less than a century later, when Priestley published his highly influential The History and Present State of Electricity with Original Experiments, he instead wrote in English to make his work more accessible. He also intentionally shaped his book with the goal of inspiring readers to conduct further experiments themselves. He wanted readers to see that they too could become scientists and further advance the frontiers of knowledge. Priestley was also fully transparent that his own discoveries were less a result of genius and much more from persistent trial and error. And speaking of experimentation without guarantee of positive results, the story of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a thunderstorm comes from Priestley's History of Electricity. Franklin himself had only published a brief third-person account of his experiment in the Pennsylvania Gazette, without specifying that he himself had performed it, but he willingly gave Priestley extensive details on the event. Unfortunately, Priestley's full transparency meant that he was a much better scientist than he was an entrepreneur. For instance, he discovered a method for carbonating water. Think of the untold trillions of dollars that have been generated by the invention of soda water. And yet Priestley happily revealed this formula in letters, pamphlets, and dinner party chatter to anyone who would listen. A certain Johann Schweppes fared better in this regard, patenting a method of carbonating water in 1783. Priestley's openness helped advance science, but wasn't always best for his family's bank account. And there are many more fascinating details that can be traced about Priestley's scientific discoveries. But for now, allow me to focus on the most famous, what Johnson calls the invention of air. The story begins in childhood when, as an 11-year-old boy, Priestley discovered, as young children sometimes do, that if you trap an insect in a sealed glass jar, it will soon die. Showing an early penchant for the scientific method, and not having an ethics committee to answer to, the 11-year-old Priestley, in an effort to understand what was happening more precisely, began closely observing how long it took spiders to die when trapped in a sealed jar. This was around 1744, before either the American or French Revolution, and to appreciate the context, it is important to try and set aside all the scientific insights we take for granted almost 300 years later. At that time, no one knew why insects died, or why candles extinguished soon after being sealed in a glass jar. Did the creatures somehow exhaust the air they were breathing, in which case what was left in the jar? Or were they poisoning their environment with some invisible substance they released? Or was some other factor at work? Before Priestley, for the most part, people thought of the space between objects as basically nothingness. Fast forwarding almost 30 years, as an adult, Priestley picked back up that line of experimentation begun in his childhood. The variation that occurred to him was to investigate what would happen if instead of a spider or a candle, he substituted a plant. In late spring, he pulled some mint from his garden. He fully expected it to wilt and die in a matter of days or weeks. But something strange and unexpected happened. The plant had stubbornly refused to die and continued growing all summer. For any young people here this morning, think of this as one of the best science fair projects ever! So simple, yet with profound results. activists would not approve of Priestley's methods. He also discovered that a mouse placed inside the jar with the plant could survive happily for 10 minutes, while a mouse placed in a plant-free jar in which another mouse had previously expired would begin to convulse within seconds. Now don't worry, here endeth the animal cruelty section of Priestley's experiments. The next insight Priestley had was to leave the mint plant sealed in a jar with a candle. When the candle burned out, he knew that no more wholesome air would remain. But 10 days later, when he went to light a candle in the glass, it burned perfectly well in it. It seemed that plants were restoring something fundamental to the air, or they were creating the air itself. Excitingly, the results were the same every time he repeated the experiment. As a result of his work, he was awarded the Kelley Medal, the Nobel Prize of its day, by the Royal Society in London on account of the many curious and useful experiments contained in his observations on different kinds of air. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time tracing one of Priestley's scientific discoveries. Part of my point for this morning is that the questions, the wonder, and the scientific curiosity that Priestley brought to his explorations of the world are equally worthy of our reflection here on Sunday morning as his theological investigations. Along those lines, it is significant that Priestley brought the same scientific rigor and empiricism that he used in the laboratory to both politics and theology. 2 years after his discovery of oxygen, the introduction to his book, Observations on Air, said that this rapid progress of knowledge will, I doubt not, be the means of extirpating all error and prejudice, and of putting an end to all undue and usurped authority in the business of religion as well as science. The English hierarchy has equal reason to tremble at an air pump or an electrical machine. He challenged that all fields, science, religion, politics, and more, must face the scrutiny of reason and experience. And to tell you some of the highlights of the religious side of his life, Priestley was a minister most of his life. His scientific experiments were conducted in his free time. I can see all the ministers going, free time. And in 1774, 2 years after Priestley won the Kelley Medal, when Theophilus Lindsay led the first Unitarian worship service in England, among the 200 people in attendance were Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Priestley. Almost a decade later, Priestley published a book entitled History of the Corruptions of Christianity that criticized those corruptions, like the Trinity, in order to restore a focus on Jesus' ethics and teachings. This book helped inspire Thomas Jefferson to create the Jefferson Bible, in which he cut out all the supernatural elements. Jefferson later wrote to Adams, "I have read Priestley's Corruptions of Christianity and early opinions of Jesus over and over again, and I rest on them as the basis of my own faith. These writings have never been answered." Each week, I began our service by saying that we seek to draw wisdom from all the world's religions, balanced with the insights of modern science. Our theological ancestors, such as Priestley, can be vital inspirations to us today and for future generations as we seek to live ever more fully into the promises of our fourth principle. Priestley died in 1804 at the age of 70. But before then, his old friend Benjamin Franklin wrote in a letter to a mutual acquaintance, "Remember me affectionately to the honest heretic, Dr. Priestley." Keep in mind that the Greek root of the word heretic simply means to choose. Franklin's letter continued, "Do not, however, mistake me. It is not to my good friend's heresy that I impute his honesty. On the contrary, 'tis his honesty that has brought upon him the character of heretic." What Franklin meant is that Priestley's honesty, his demand that we rely not on what others have told us is allegedly the truth, but that we test for ourselves what the truth actually is, that demand brought upon Priestley the character of heretic, the character of one who chooses for him or herself. May it be so for us. When faced with second-hand information that we discover to be untrue, may we listen to the still small voice of our conscience and be honest to what we know is true in the crucible of our own first-hand experience. May the honest heretics that shaped our living tradition inspire the legacy that we leave to future generations. May we choose for ourselves with integrity and authenticity.